So welcome to this Stratton Craig webinar around the changing language on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about the findings of an analysis done by Stratton Craig around how major companies are reporting on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the current climate. We're going to present the four key approaches that we've seen companies taking over the last year. And we're going to particularly look at the differences between reporting approaches in the US, UK, and Europe, as well as how it has changed from 2024 to 2025. We won't be speaking for the full hour because that's too long, but we will probably have time at the end for some questions, and we'll probably finish around 35 40 minutes in. So hopefully you can stay with us because there's a lot of interesting information that we'd love to share. And if you do have a question as we go along, if you want to pop it into the Q&A function rather than the chat, we will be answering those at the end. So to tell you a little bit about us, for those of you who aren't familiar with Stratton Craig, we're a copywriting and content strategy agency based in Bristol, but we partner with organizations all around the world to help them tell their stories. And we apply the critical skill of storytelling to communication and stakeholder engagement challenges. That means developing brand language, content strategy, and copy that inspires trust, belief, and loyalty built around our clients' organizational objectives. So we're very big on writing for impact. We've been doing this for almost 40 years now, and we've worked across all sectors and written content formats. And obviously, those formats have changed considerably in the 40 years since we've been doing this. In the background here, you'll see some of the companies we've partnered with, and they range from global household names to scale-ups and startups, and covering a really broad range of sectors. We're also part of the Positive Change Group, which is a group of agencies specializing in communication, stakeholder engagement, and culture. The group is based in London and Singapore, but also has a presence in Europe and the US. And our aim as a collective is to help businesses communicate authentically with their stakeholders through these complex and unpredictable times. So my name's Claire Wilson, and I'm head of copy and strategy here at Stratton Craig. So I lead the team of writers, but I'm also a writer myself, and I have worked with a lot of companies on their annual and sustainability reports. So I have a really close interest in how companies are talking about DEI and all things sustainability as well. I'm going to hand over to Ruth, who is the researcher and the writer behind this wonderful work that we're talking about today. So I'm very much here in the capacity as a backup singer, and I'll hand over to Ruth to run through the slides of the. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Lovely to see you all today. I have been a writer for about getting on for 30 years now. God, that makes me feel very old. And I joined Stratton Craig 2022. And since then, I've been specializing in sustainability reports for large organizations. Okay, so no doubt you have seen the headlines which reverberated around the world. Not every story begins with Donald Trump, but we probably wouldn't be sitting here today talking about this if he hadn't arrived back in the White House on the 20th of January, 2025, and immediately, within hours of starting Presidency 2.0, issued this executive order to end government diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which he described as illegal and immoral discrimination. Next day brought another executive order, and this is the one that really rattled businesses. It was called Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity, and it directed federal agencies to investigate publicly traded corporations and other organizations suspected of practicing illegal DEI discrimination and preferences. The text had a pretty chilling effect on corporate America, and high-profile organizations that had already scaled back their diversity initiatives a few weeks earlier, like these guys, were joined by a wave of others. The text had a chilling effect on corporate America, and companies that defended their DEI practices really stood out. They became quite conspicuous. In March, the government wrote to major European corporations that supplied or sought to supply goods or services to the US government, saying, watch out, this executive order applies to you too. And that's what made us think at Stratton Craig, what's the bigger picture when you stand back and look at the response of large organizations on both sides of the Atlantic? How are they articulating themselves in the midst of this DEI backlash? To find out, we analysed the sustainability reports of 50 listed companies in the US, the UK, and Europe, and compared the DEI-related disclosures they published in 2025 with what they said in 2024. Just a quick word there about methodology. When I say sustainability reports, I mean the main sustainability disclosures, and that could be the sustainability report, the impact report, corporate responsibility, even the annual report, ESG. The critical thing was that we wanted to be able to compare like for like formats from one year to the next. And another key point is that we looked purely at workforce diversity. We weren't looking at supplier diversity or community DEI efforts, and we didn't study the narrative around board diversity. So, as well as trying to understand how individual businesses have responded, we wanted to look at regional differences and kind of tease those out and see if an Atlantic divide had opened up. And out of this snapshot study, we've identified 4 key trends, which we'll take you through now. Starting with strategic simplification. So going back 2 or 3 years, every company we worked with in the UK, US, or Europe wanted to talk to us at length about diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI was shorthand for responsible and successful business, and companies typically described it as a cornerstone of their strategies, central to their purpose, a driver of their success. And we saw these very confident, sweeping, emphatic statements. Here's a US company reporting in 2024 saying it is strategically important to our business to garner a broader, deeper range of perspectives among employees. That same company didn't even have a DEI related section the next year. In fact, coverage of workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion shrank by 30% in the 2025 reports we analysed. US companies essentially cut their coverage in half, just slightly over. Companies in the EU slashed their content by 22%, and the cut was more subtle in the UK, but still noticeable at 14%. Well, in that disappearing act went a lot of strategic detail until only recently, companies went into a lot of detail on their DEI strategies, policies, and initiatives, backed up by targets often or some kind of commitment. They mentioned DEI leaders by job title, if not by name, and they emphasized board oversight. But in 2025, DEI strategy was really de-emphasized, especially in the United States. We saw this particularly with diversity. Although 70% of companies continue to disclose data on the demographic makeup of their workforces, there was much less commentary accompanying it. Instead, the narrative focused on inclusive cultures, pay equity, and objective recruitment practices. Here you can see the percentage of companies that dedicated less, more, or the same amount of space to DEI-related content in 2025. Overall, then, 35 of the 50 companies disclosed less, and this was really dramatic in the US. 90% of companies we looked at wrote less on DEI last year. And I have to say that actually of the 5 reports that did have more prominent disclosures, that was more because of bigger graphics or more case studies rather than strategic detail. In the EU, 60% of companies dedicated less space to DEI, and in the UK, 55%. I started at Stratton Craig in 2022, so less than 2 years after the death of George Floyd, the African American man who was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis. At that time, movements like Black Lives Matter and hashtag Me Too were top of mind, and businesses were under a completely different kind of stakeholder pressure to confront what Joe Biden's government described as the unbearable human costs of systemic racism. In fact, in Biden's own executive order, also published within hours of him coming to office in January 2021, he called for equity for all, including people of colour and others who have been historically underserved, marginalised, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. Lots of our clients responded with workforce diversity targets by making this concerted effort to increase the representation in their workforces of people who were underrepresented. They could show that they were actually making a difference. They didn't just have a DEI strategy, they had a way to measure and deliver impact. So where are we with that now? We looked at the percentage of companies with clear coverage in the main body of the report of measurable commitments to increase employee representation. So, for example, by gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, disability, veteran status, etc. And what we found is that it looks like many companies, especially in the States, now consider it risky to have workforce diversity targets, or at least to disclose them. Not a single one of the US companies we looked at disclosed workforce representation targets in their 2025 reports, whereas 30% did in 2024. And you might think that's obvious. They're massive organizations and they're doing business for the government. But actually, only 11 of the 20 we analysed had received federal funds within the last 3 years, typically from government contracts. So around half had received no money from the government in recent years. For now, the UK is bucking the trend, even though most of the companies we looked at did have operations in the US. 70% are still declaring demographic targets. That's only a modest drop from 80% in 2024. And we'll see, I guess, maybe this year or next, whether this is an intentional decision by UK companies to stay the course or just a lag in their alignment with norms across the Atlantic. We did notice, for example, one UK company saying it wouldn't use workforce diversity targets going forward out of respect for its operating environment, although it had already achieved the targets it had set for that year. In Europe, the dropping of targets has been much more dramatic, from 90% in 2024 to just 30% in 2025. That seems directly linked to the return of Donald Trump to office. Whereas if we go back to the US figures for a moment, only 30% were disclosing targets in 2024 anyway. And that's because US corporate appetite for them and for DEI generally has been cooling for a few years now, triggered not just by Donald Trump, so much as by these guys, the United States Supreme Court. As you probably know, in 2023, they made a landmark ruling that race could no longer be considered as a factor in university admissions, essentially saying that affirmative action violates the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we certainly saw corporate America dampening its enthusiasm for DEI generally after that ruling in 23. The next finding of our analysis was the widespread disappearance of the word diversity from workforce-related reporting in 2025. Here's a classic example from a US company. In 2024, it said, "We recognize that our strength is in our diverse workforce." And then in 2025, that became, "We recognize that our strength is in our workforce." In 2024, almost 8 out of 10 companies mention diversity in the title of DEI related sections. This year, only 3 in 10 did, and only 1 in 20 companies, US companies, that is. In the UK and EU, diversity was mentioned in the titles about half as often as a year earlier. One US company we analysed used the word diversity 75 times in 2024, and then in 2025 they used it once. That was a pretty major turnaround. Companies have been talking proudly and earnestly about diversity in their workforces for decades, especially in the United States. If you go back through the archives, some of the sustainability reporting archives, go back to 2001, and you can see diversity talked about there. And I think the belief that people with a variety of backgrounds and perspectives make businesses stronger has been taking hold since the 1980s. Our clients have told us it's good for their business if their workforces reflect the customers and communities they serve. And they often quoted researchers this series of studies from McKinsey, which consistently found an association between the diversity of executive teams and the financial performance of a company. Let's see how diversity hushing has played out in reports. Here's a UK company reporting in 2024. We continue to strengthen our approach to diversity with the rollout of a diversity, equity and inclusion DE&I playbook. And then in 2025, this was reworded to, we continue to strengthen our approach on this important topic with the rollout of our inclusion and allyship playbook. So you'll notice, spot the difference, that diversity and equity are stripped out there, but inclusion still gets a name check. And that was certainly the dominant theme in the EU and UK. Inclusion, the word, is still widely used on this side of the Atlantic and in the US too. But over there, you'd get words like culture and belonging becoming big, frequently used umbrella terms for what would once have been DEI. We also saw terms such as gender balance and gender parity favoured over diversity when referring to the representation of women. As we mentioned earlier, many companies dropped the word diversity, equity and inclusion from chapter headings. But when you look at how this played out, really, they were ditching the term diversity and equity to some degree, and either subsuming the narrative into a broader culture or talent chapter, or reframing it as inclusion, allyship, belonging, etc. Also, fairness and opportunity were words that sprang up a lot. Another example of diversity hushing, this time from the States. We strive to recruit and hire diverse candidates and advance qualified women, minorities, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. That's a US company reporting in 2024. The following year, it wrote, we strive to recruit and hire qualified candidates who will bring a variety of experiences, perspectives, and ideas to the workplace. What we noticed here is that companies were much less likely to refer directly to groups of people like women or people from ethnic minorities, and especially to refer to them as being underrepresented or historically disadvantaged, which I guess are terms that imply that some action must be taken to redress the balance or to right some historic wrong. And yet you can see in that second quote, the idea that diverse workforces are good for business has not gone anywhere. Most companies continue to express the opinion that a variety of perspectives enhanced their thinking and their customer relationships improved when workforces reflected the communities they served. It's just that they are not necessarily using the word diversity anymore to say that. Most companies have also dropped the acronyms routinely used in the past to sum up diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, such as DEI, DE&I, D&I, etc. You know how much the corporate world loves an acronym. just 28% of companies overall and none in the US use these labels this year. In the reports we looked at anyway, it looks like they've become politically charged and polarizing. Um, Personally, I'm not sorry to see them go. There's good evidence that acronyms slow readers down. And even if you think people know what they mean, sometimes they lose meaning. For example, what does E stand for here? Usually equity, but sometimes equality. Those have different meanings. That said, I have been using the acronym throughout this webinar, so I can't really talk. Acronyms have their place, I suppose.
Especially when you're trying to create a catchy title for a webinar.
Absolutely, Claire.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to take over and discuss the third trend that Ruth's research identified, and that is around the rise of meritocracy. So in 2025, there was a real defensiveness in corporate responsibility reporting on both sides of the Atlantic. There was a real sense that companies were at pains to justify their approach to recruitment, promotion, and pay. And here are a couple of examples. So this is an example from the EU in 2025. We continue to drive an organization that is unwavering in its support for a true meritocracy. And then another one, our company has focused on access and opportunities for women at all levels in the company through merit-based selection processes in compliance with anti-discrimination laws. So skip forward. This is a noticeable contrast with 2024 style reporting. Back then, DEI programs were often described in warm, inspirational language as being a moral imperative or core to foundational values. And now we're seeing them couched in terms of objectivity, fairness, compliance. And many companies are emphasizing that their employment practices are based on skills and experience. And I guess it ties back to the executive order that Ruth flashed up earlier, that focus on meritocracy. And as you can see in this table here, references to oh, it's hard to say, championing DEI, or DEI being the right thing to do, almost halved last year in the reports we analysed, whereas mentions of the words merit or qualified in relation to talent almost doubled. One EU company mentioned merit 10 times in relation to their candidates and employees in 2025, with zero mentions in 2024. And I'm sure it's not that their candidates didn't have merit. We saw companies adopt a much more legalistic tone, using caveats such as within the legal parameters of the countries where we operate, or where lawful and appropriate when talking about inclusive hiring. And while many companies are obviously still actively diversifying their candidate pools by reaching out to particular groups, the rhetoric is now firmly positioning diversity as a byproduct of fair and objective processes rather than of equitable treatment or targets that they're going out of their way to include. And now to the final trend that we observed, those companies doubling down on DEI. So I'll use my phone voice for you. It would be easy in times of challenge to reduce activities and attention to this important area of work. That's what a director at one UK company said in its annual report in 2024. And the next year, it doubled down. Our focus on equality, diversity, and inclusion remains unchanged at both board and a wider organizational level. So, while most companies, 68% of them, toned down their DEI reporting this year, as Ruth's already covered off, an active minority held steady, 22%, or even ramped up with 10% of disclosures. We found this particularly in the UK, where 9 of the 20 companies we analysed dedicated as much, if not more, space to DEI in 2025, compared with just 2 companies in the US. And whether these players are going to be rewarded for not bowing to political pressure or punished for ignoring the political zeitgeist remains to be seen, but it's clear they're conscious of standing out from the crowd. And saying that, though, the double downers were not all the same. We found that generally they fell into 4 main camps. So first, the DEI differentiators. These businesses are doubling down as a differentiator, intentionally, deliberately. They continue to use warm, values-centric language. They often showcase their DEI awards or accreditations, suggesting that they're focusing on engaging with their existing or prospective talent. Next, we've got the reframing realists. Gosh, we do love a little bit of alliteration, don't we? These companies are firm believers in the business case for DEI, but are treading cautiously due to the political environment. They've maintained DEI coverage, but taking a much more defensive stance. For example, changing headings, like we talked about earlier, from promoting diversity and inclusion to something like talent diversity, a performance lever. Next, we've got the incidental activists. These, there are just a couple of these, though, to be fair. But these are the companies that were only a year or two into high-profile new DEI programs or objectives. Poor timing, one suspects. And backtracking now could be reputationally risky, or drawing more scrutiny, or potentially alienating their people and consumers, who may agree with these values, and they also might want to not lose the cost that they've invested in those programs already. So we'll see how those strategies evolve this year, and we'll be looking closely to watch that. And finally, we have a group that we've just described as the consistent minimalists. So this group was already emphasizing a meritocratic stance to employment matters and typically quite sparing in its coverage of strategic narrative on DEI matters anyway. So the fact that they've maintained their approach isn't really a sense that they've changed their commitment to DEI, it's that it was already largely sparing and they didn't need to feel the pressure to cut back or change their approach for this year. So I'm going to hand back to Ruth now to run over and summarize our conclusions from the research.
Yeah, overall, the impression of this analysis, and it was snapshot analysis, we looked at 50 reports, is that business leaders are very nervous about saying too much or the wrong thing, quote, wrong thing. They're walking this tightrope between conflicting stakeholder expectations and trying to keep everyone happy. Hardly any businesses actually acknowledge the political climate in their reports. The fact that they're feeling under intense scrutiny and I feel like they're on shifting sands, basically. This unassuming little snippet in a US report gave us a glimmer of insight into the discussions that might be going on behind the scenes. We will continue our balanced approach and not comment on many potentially polarizing issues that are increasingly part of news headlines and social media. It's a sort of no comment that says everything, really. And this here might be the corporate understatement of the year. There are stark and ever-changing differences in the expectations stakeholders have for how businesses engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. That's the grocery chain Walmart on speaking about DEI in its 2025 ESG report. They weren't actually part of our research, but we just came across that. And I think it's captures some of the torment that organizations all over the world have felt in the last year over this extremely contentious issue. What I think is telling ultimately is that all but one of the 50 reports we looked at, the 50 companies, it was 100 reports, is that all but one of the companies in our analysis did report on workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion in some form in 2025. They might not have used those exact words, they might have changed their tone and their terminology, but most still made the business case for an inclusive approach that fosters a workforce with a variety of perspectives and reflects the communities it serves. We're not here today to tell you how to shape your people strategy. Our partners in the Positive Change Group can certainly help you with that. But our role is to help organizations articulate themselves clearly and authentically in a way that inspires trust, whatever their strategy and objectives. That said, I did find this research by More in Common, University of Oxford and UCL Policy Lab interesting. I don't know if you've come across More in Common. They're a research-led organisation and consultancy focusing on understanding divisions within society and identifying ways to build common ground and social cohesion. And they divide the British population, so this is in the UK, into 7 distinct groups based on their core values, beliefs, and worldviews rather than on demographics. So you've got loyal nationals, progressive activists, civic pragmatists, disengaged battlers, established liberals, disengaged traditionalists, and backbone conservatives. And in their April 2025 research on what EDI, so equality, diversity, and inclusion, they found that Britons want a pragmatic approach based on respect and equal opportunity. They found that support for EDI had softened slightly from 62% to 52%. That's viewing it as a good thing, but only 14% actively saw it as a bad thing. More in Common concluded that these findings suggest the need to refine rather than abandon current approaches. You don't need me to tell you that we're living in an era of tightening regulation and standards. In the coming years, more and more companies around the world will come under the remit of either the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, in the EU, that is, or the International Sustainability Standards Board reporting frameworks. CSRD, in any case, requires companies under its mandate to publicly disclose the representation of women and/or ethnic groups or minorities in their workforce, as well as age distribution and the percentage of employees with disabilities. They must also explain how they ensure equal treatment and opportunities for all, including gender equality and equal pay for work of equal value, as well as inclusion of persons with disability and an overall approach to diversity. The ISSB, they've yet to issue reporting standards for human capital topics, but we might see a draft within the next couple of years. It could include specific DEI related requirements. It might not. We'll see. That's my understanding of the latest. As I say, we're not DEI specialists, we're content specialists. Meanwhile, emerging changes to employment law, such as the EU Pay Transparency Directive and the UK's Employment Rights Bill 2025, will force a growing number of companies to report on their gender pay gaps. So, all in all, while some companies have been dreading the administrative burden of specifically of CSRD if they come under that remit, new reporting requirements might actually turn out to be a blessing and take some of the heat out of this debate.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth. And that brings us to the end of the webinar today. Thank you all very much for joining us. We have got a couple of questions in the queue, but if you have any questions you would like to pop in now, feel free to type them into the Q&A function here, and Ruth and I will try and answer them. Alternatively, we will follow up the webinar with an email. You can always get in touch with us separately if you've got something you'd like to discuss in a bit more detail. And in terms of questions we've got coming through now, Ruth, this one might be for you actually. Um, do you have any general recommendations on language to use or avoid?
I thought I might get asked something like this. Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a different kind of webinar from what we normally do. We try to give actionable advice normally, and whereas this webinar has really been about sharing our observations about what's happened in the reporting landscape. Um, how you action what we've said today, if you action it, is very much going to be dependent on your specific circumstances, your operating environment. So, for example, we've seen in the States how certain words have become extremely loaded, like diversity and equity, and certain words are becoming more prominent, like merit-based, meritocratic, um, and so on. But it will also depend on your market presence. It will depend on your values as a company. What you've reported on in the past, how you've articulated yourself in the past, the views of your stakeholders, even your tone of voice. I mean, I don't know if you saw how Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream brand, reacted. I think I've got something that they said here. We believe that companies that timidly bow to the current political climate by attempting to turn back the clock will become increasingly uncompetitive in the marketplace and will ultimately be judged as having been on the wrong side of history. So, very bold language, very
Oh,
assertive, defiant, values led, you know, somewhat confrontational, bringing in other companies and quite adversarial, you might say. But then that is their brand. They position themselves as an activist brand. It's not, necessarily going to be right for every company. Certainly not. Um,
yeah, I think that's a good point, Ruth. It really is about the nuance, isn't it? And each company will have its own tone of voice that we need to consider and also its own set of stakeholders, so it's really difficult to say there's one right answer about what language to use or not use.
that's right. I did see some language that I liked in one of the reports I looked at. I think I have made a note of it in my notes, so we'll just consult. Yeah, this is a US company, and they dropped the word diversity in 2025, and they stopped using the word underserved and underrepresented. But this is what they said. A core principle of our recruiting strategy is that the best talent doesn't always come from the established recruiting channels. We are focused on attracting talent from all life paths and supporting them into leadership roles. Then they talk about how they've participated in lots of recruiting events with universities and the military. And they say this helped us cast a wide recruiting net, enabling groups who have not traditionally been included in our hiring pipeline to learn about the company and apply for a position. I kind of like that. It's very plain English. It's
Matter of
very
fact, isn't it?
yeah, it's very measured, pragmatic. It's almost like they've deliberately depolarized it. They're not using any labels. They're not,
Mm,
and it's also very dispassionate. Do you know what I mean?
yeah. And I
Um,
think it's a good example. I mean, we would say this, wouldn't we, as writers? But the way language can do that, it can add heat to something and take heat out, and that's
mm.
why word choice can be really, really important. We have had another question pop up actually, and it's something that we should have mentioned already, Ruth, but we didn't. Asking where the findings of a study is published, and it is absolutely published in a report on our website. So we'll also share that with everybody afterwards as a follow-up. And then I think we've got time for one final question. Should we move our DEI content under a general culture or talent chapter? Good question. And it is,
Mm.
to be honest, it is something we're seeing a little bit of at the moment. I've got an opinion on this, Ruth, unless you want to dive in, but
No, go ahead, Claire, go ahead.
I I think it makes really logical, good sense for the DEI stuff to be included in cultural talent anyway. We recommend a narrative or storytelling approach to reports anyway, and it fits really naturally in that space in terms of something that you've embedded as part of your approach to your people strategy anyway. And that's quite a good strategy for people who want to continue what they're doing and not appear to be sort of changing horses midstream, so to speak, or responding to the changing winds. But it's a really natural fit if you do feel some sensitivity from stakeholders, you need to avoid sort of additional scrutiny. Ruth, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's sensible, Claire, because I think that sometimes because DEI touches every element of employment practices, from talent acquisition, learning and development, employee engagement, it makes sense to drop in that information as you're going along through the chapters. And you know, unless you have reported at great length and have something very, very specific to say about your DEI strategy, it's maybe not necessary to have a dedicated chapter. You could end up duplicating content that would sit better elsewhere and might feel you might feel like your DEI chapter is actually not contradicting, but that it kind of stands alone when
Yeah.
actually your whatever your approach is, it will be completely woven. So I think you're right, Claire. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, thank you, Ruth. I think we've come to the end of the questions, and thank you everyone very much for joining us today. We hope you found it as interesting as we found it when Ruth first presented the findings to us. And obviously, if you have any more questions about what we do, or if we could help support you on any reporting, obviously, please do get in touch. Thanks again.
Thank you.